Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now. All right, check-ins. I feel calm and stoic. So welcome to the Stoa. I'm Peter Lindbergh, the steward of the Stoa, and the Stoa is a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this moment. And before I introduce today's guest, just give Erik and whoever's new here some idea of what the Stoic actually is. At this point, I don't know how to even describe it, but sort of this online digital campfire that's organically emerged that has a couple components to it. One of them being a wisdom gym, where we have a lot of cool events, regular sessions, which John Vervaeke calls an ecology of practices where we can actually practice wisdom. And then we have other ones like sense-making series where we invite people who have or epistemic authorities in certain areas and can have Q&As like this. And there's sort of like a community, a village forming here. And the idea here is that we want to move away from memetic tribes to embodied tribes because beauty is found in communitas. So that's a little esoteric 101 for what the Stoa is about. And today we have Erik Davis. And I'll just read something I pulled from Wikipedia real brief if you have no idea who Erik Davis is. He's an American writer, scholar, journalist, and public speaker whose writings have ranged from rock criticism to culture analysis to creative explorations of esoteric mysticism. He's author of a few books, one of them Technosis, and most recently High Weirdness. And he has this excellent podcast, Expanding Minds. If you haven't Expanding Mind. If you haven't listened to it, I'd highly recommend it. I was actually on it maybe like a year or so ago. We talked about culture war, memetic tribes, and stoicism. So what's going to happen today? Erik is going to present his thoughts on the high weirdness of our situation that we're in. And then I'll warm up with a few questions, and then we'll have questions for the group. If you have any questions, write in the chat box. This is going to be on YouTube. So if you don't want to be on YouTube, just ask me to read it on your behalf, and I will do so. And in total, we have 60 minutes together. So that being said, I will hand it over to you, Erik.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks, Peter, for inviting me. And nice to see everybody showing up. I recognize a few friendly, familiar faces. So Peter mentioned I just published a book recently called High Weirdness, Drugs, Esoterica, and Visionary Experience in the 1970s. And when I started this project, I was really just interested in some psychedelic and visionary figures from the 70s, Philip K. Dick, Terence McKenna, and Robert Anton Wilson. And I just sort of noticed some similarities between what they were doing. And so I really wanted to tell a story about the 1970s and about these wild and woolly psychonauts and writers who were both visionary in their experiences, visionary and extreme in their experiences and in their writings. But as I was writing it more and more and kind of like the world was changing around me, I started to realize more and more that I was using these things to kind of try to understand something about what's happening to us today. And while I didn't end up spending that much time in the book reflecting on how this weirdness reflected the conditions today, I did some. As I spent like a year doing podcasts about the book, which are, kind of trailed off now, although I did an audiobook version that came out earlier this year. And so I did some more press around that and some more discussions. And I really like the way the audiobook came out. A lot of people find it a little easier to take than the somewhat academic density of the book. But as I was doing these talks, I realized more and more I was just talking about what was going on now, the politics of consciousness now, the politics of psychedelics now. Why are all these things going on now? How do we navigate a meltdown in consensus reality, which has a kind of psychedelic quality, not necessarily a particularly pleasant one, and that's part of what I was writing about as well, was not some kind of happy, fluffy, psychedelic sort of ideology that you're getting these days, but really more wrestling with some of the darker sides of it, the relationship to psychopathology, the relationship to paranoia, what happens when you have a break, what happens when you have an extraordinary experience you can't integrate, and what happens especially when those things start to resonate and reflect on uh, actual political realities that themselves aren't particularly rosy. I think one thing that I would want to say, just to connect it, like, why is he talking about the 70s, is that in a lot of ways, if we can look back at all and find a moment in American history, and I think this is, as true, I have to say North American history perhaps, but certainly the United States, that the closest era that we have to what I think a lot of people are experiencing now is the early 70s, because it was a time of disappointment, of frustration. There was a lot of divergence in identity. In fact, a lot of the sort of multicultural world that we're familiar with now was in many ways kind of both celebrated and engineered at that time in history. So there's more and more lifestyles and more perspectives. There's more and more multiculturalism going on in good and in challenging ways. And at the same time, there was an overall vibe of bummer. There was a energy crisis in the early 70s. There was the rise of the modern terrorist. Then it was a lot of hijackings of planes, but there were lots of bombs going off in the United States and Europe. There was a sense of tremendous tension. There was still a lot of racial tension. There was this endless war going on in Vietnam, and there was increasing evidence that there was like radical malfeasance at the heart of the U.S. government in the presidency, and a sense of a tremendous social divide, and also a sense that things weren't really necessarily going to get better, that the revolution that everybody thought was going to happen sometime in the 60s, whether it was political or metaphysical or psychedelic or all of it together, that it just wasn't going to happen. And so people were kind of thrown back on their own devices and had to make their own meaning. They had to participate in a kind of sense making. And from our distance now, we can see a lot of the ways that went south. A lot of the what we come to call the New Age, and a lot of psychotherapy groups, and a lot of cults, a lot of new religious movements, a lot of gurus from the East. Like, that was the time when all this stuff really got rolling, kind of in the wake of the disappointments of the counterculture, but the sense that something else had to happen. We had to make meaning together, individually. And so the whole mode of the seeker, as someone who was perhaps looking for more spiritual solutions, but in many cases, and this was certainly very true for the people that I was writing about, is that they all had political motivations in a weird way for plunging into psychedelic experience in their own strange experiments. They weren't like dropping out exactly. It was more a sense that since reality is sort of incomprehensible or spiraling out of control, why not see if like this kind of stuff is going to work? And I think the final little motif that comes up, that's definitely related to some of the mimetic tribe stuff, not just the sense of multiple perspectives and society being forcibly expand to acknowledge these multiple perspectives, but also some of the inherent rabbit holing that goes on, and particularly the rise of conspiracy theory. And this is the final kind of connection that I'd make, is that paranoia was like a dominant emotion in these years, particularly in the early 70s. There was always paranoia in the counterculture because there was so much infiltration by the FBI, by police, COINTELPRO. In fact, a lot of years people thought, oh, you guys are just being paranoid. And then like when we actually find out how much malfeasance was being practiced by these hidden agencies who were not just observing, but acting as agent provocateurs, and making political moves, not as well as bumping people off. I mean, it was really a nasty scene that a lot of paranoia was justified. But it grew into a sort of more psychic cosmological frame in the 1970s. And if you go through, or especially early 70s popular culture, which is saturated with sort of psychedelia and melancholy and a kind of technological frustration and paranoia, you see a lot of the great kind of conspiracy movies come up in the early to mid 1970s, that's another kind of point of resonance. And finally, along these lines, just to kind of underscore a connection, and then we can talk more about now, the chapters that I wrote about Robert Anton Wilson are particularly important in this zone, because Robert Anton Wilson wrote a book with a co-author, Robert Shea. They wrote it in the late 60s mostly, but it came out in 1975, called Illuminatus. And in Illuminatus, they play in a anarchic, romping, goofy, kind of brilliant, kind of satirical, kind of pulp fiction-y way with the ideas of conspiracy, basically the idea that all conspiracies are true. And in that game, they have all this lore about the Illuminati, which is partly based on actual conspiracy theory, partly based on actual history, and then partly stuff that they were just inventing and making up, drawing from occult fiction and science fiction and weird stuff, and making a lot of it up. But in many ways, the environment, the vibe of the book is very resonant now, particularly when we think about how central conspiracy theory has come to be in terms of consensus reality. How to think about it, how it works, and in some ways, how to sort of move through it. Like, rather than just put it aside and say, oh, that's all the crazy stuff that the people who can't think are indulging themselves in. Instead going, well, actually, we have to look at it because there's some stuff in there that is factually true, and there's some stuff in there even more so that is allegorically true. Meaning that it's like, okay, it might not be literally true, but it's a really good myth or fiction or allegory for other sorts of social processes and transformations that the mainstream can't recognize because it runs on denying them. So as a thinking person, as a meta thinker, as a sense maker, you have to kind of go through aspects of the conspiracy world. But how do you do it and not lose the plot? And in some ways, I try to read Illuminatus and Wilson's own thought. And in some sense, he was stoic in some ways, but he certainly was a philosophically informed weirdo thinker. That he kind of in a way modeled ways of passing through, in a way, the chapel perilous of that conspiracy and esoteric experience and radical derealization of consensus reality leads you to. And in some ways, I feel like that's part of the job of the edge thinker now, is to be willing to step aside or step off the whatever remains of a kind of consensus mainstream view, but do so in a very pragmatic, tactical, and well-practiced way, in order to extend the space of collective sense making and not become overly lured into positions that I think ultimately undermine that collective embodied empirical relationship or practice that is called upon us when reality as a consensus thing and even as a physical space-time matrix is clearly crumbling and transforming. So I think I'll stop there for the intro.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. Robert Anton Wilson was a huge influence on me in his sort of guerrilla ontology. How you purposely expose yourself to these bizarre ideas to kind of create that cognitive dissonance so you can kind of be comfortable with them in a way. And I find that very helpful, especially with the conspiracy theory narratives, because if you just dive into that like a performative agnostic and act as if it's true, it's like radical paranoia overcomes you. And then if you don't have a good relationship with that, you're going to run into some of these narratives. So I'm at the Stoa here. People know I'm using this like term liminal war instead of the culture war. We're like this liminal state right now, and there's like a war in order to kind of gaslight our minds into believing certain narratives. And what is your sense of this state, especially with the conspiracy theory stuff coming on, like QAnon and all this energy that's happening in the noosphere right now?
Yeah, well, one of the ways that I deal with it is I try to act like an anthropologist or a cultural a historian or something like that, which is that I don't try to put on my mind the decision about what it means or what truth is in it, because in some ways, if you go into the zone, if you go down the rabbit hole looking to figure out what you think is true, you're already hooked in a certain way. Like that's the bait, or that's some of the bait. And it doesn't mean that that's not something you're going to want to know and want to do, but I try to like get at it from a kind of another angle. And I think one of the ways to do it is also sort of be looking for the allegorical meaning of it, so that you're not either going yes or no. So it's not like, oh, I find out, okay, you say whatever, Bill Gates is this and that, and okay, the vaccine has these little implanted chips in it, da da da, and that's actually happening. You know, I have enough investment in, let's call it, what remains of journalistic integrity and scientific procedures and conventional forms of authority that I don't believe that. But if I go in there and I go, okay, no, that's bullshit, you're just crazy, then all I can really do, if I even want to empathize with you, is maybe say, well, you're paranoid and you didn't have very good education, so you're not really taught critical thinking, blah blah blah. Basically, just be kind of a snob to write them off. But that's not what I'm talking about. That's not this perilous path. So it's to go in there and actually really reckon with the allegory. What is the historical condition that is being narrativized or mythologized with elements of truth? I'm not saying it's all bullshit. I'm just saying that it gets constellated as a myth, because the myth has something to say that in many ways is more, well, certainly more convincing to me, but often more pertinent than the specifics of a particular scenario, which is, you know, lies right next to all sorts of other scenarios. So it's almost like you're going in there trying to get a picture of a bigger world. It's almost like a dream analysis, where you go into the dream, you don't, the surface of the dream, the details of the surface of the dream, maybe they're useful, maybe they're not, but the pattern of the dream, and most importantly, the affect of the dream is significant. And that's another part of, I think, being a sense maker today. And you talk about being embodied, and the embodiment to me isn't just that you're grounded in your own physical practice, your own capacity to be, you know, strong and balanced and healthy as you can be within this, just as a way to keep some ground in the picture, but the body is also the emotions. It's also affect. And it's important to actually stress that little technical difference, because when we say emotions, we tend to mean the emotions that we can name, that are, I'm feeling fear right now, I'm really scared, or like, oh, you're being, you know, oh, this is joyful, I'm really so happy that you said that. And those are, we can identify emotion, happiness, emotion, fear. Affect is something a little bit below that clear surface. We may be motivated by affects that we're not aware of. It's not quite like instinct. That's a little strong. It's a little behavioral. Affect is more like a feeling, but a feeling that isn't necessarily acknowledged. And here's a really clear example that plays into both the conversation about memetic tribes and conspiracy theory, but from the past, so it's easier to see. Which is like, if you look at the rise of right-wing radio, you know, let's say in the 80s, 90s, you know, right around there. But whenever you tapped into it, it still goes on all you want. And, you know, as part of this Robert Anton Wilson practice of listening to people that you don't agree with and really sort of like wrestling with it and trying not to just write it off, but not trying to believe it, but kind of resonating with it is a metaphor I use a lot. Like, what does it mean to resonate with a white nationalist? And just, what does that mean? Like, where are they coming from? Where are they coming from? And to me, that's part of, just as a little side note, that's part of, again, being a kind of practitioner of this liminal space, is to develop the capacity for real resonance, which doesn't mean agreement, but it also doesn't mean putting a label on someone so you can just put it over there on the other side of the table. It means, like, what does this feel like? What are the cluster of images and emotions and stories and histories that are coming together in this position of a contemporary white nationalist or a boogaloo boy or whatever the heck it is, and allowing yourself to resonate as a form of understanding that doesn't imply any kind of agreement or support of these positions. So that's just how I do. I mean, I'm not saying everyone should do it, but that's what I mean by being kind of an anthropologist, as a way of moving through these worlds. So to take the example, so I used to listen to a lot of right-wing radio when I was driving alone. I just go to the AM dial and I was, you know, I'd listen to it and whatever. And here, you know, it's a great example what I'm talking about. You can listen to the arguments they say this, they spin this news story this way. People call up and they don't have a lot of good knowledge, and they're referring to things that never happened or whatever. You can stay on that level of like language and argument and information and history and whatever. Okay, fine. But after a while, I was like, wait, that stuff is all just like a play. It's all just it's like again, a lure. What's really going on here is just the generation of a few basic affects. So you develop the sense of being out of control, and then you develop a sense of being righteous. You develop a sense of resentment. Ooh, a lot of resentment. So that the story, you could almost look at like what's being managed here are these very powerful affects that are collectively organized and then latched onto various talking points. So once you get into the way in which right-wing radio, like, and all the political parties do this, I'm not that the left does it just as much, where there's certain affects that are generated and then they're attached to particular talking points or narrative events that are going on in the news cycle as a way to give them more weight. On the liberal side, let's say when they were jailing the children of undocumented people crossing the border, and it was this understandable response. And yet the way in which the child and the cage and all that was sort of manipulated, if you will, through the news cycle amongst liberal progressives. And you could even see the way people were like, that's my line in the sand. That's it. I can't take it anymore. Was like, oh, that's more of that stuff. So that affect awareness, getting wise. And that's part of resonance. Part of resonating with somebody else is to get their affect, which you can appreciate even if you don't believe it's justifiable. You don't actually deserve that kind of resentment, man. You're doing pretty good. Or you really don't agree with the way that it's attached itself to a kind of narrative. But the affect itself is more like in your body. It's more like that's actually there, whether you want it to be or you having a story about it or not. So that's kind of a way that I try to move through this stuff. And it's hard. It's really hard with conspiracy theory. I don't particularly like it very much anymore. I used to be interested in it more when I was younger, and I was into Robert Anton Wilson. And it was kind of a thrill because it was a way of playing with my own paranoia as a kind of, like sniffing glue or something, like, whoa, I'm getting really paranoid and had a weird dream, and like, wow. And now I tend to feel more burdened by the terror of confusion that exists behind people's convictions. It's like, I can't believe the conviction. I'm sorry. You don't have the evidence to produce this coherent a model of this entire other nefarious, multi-tentacled historical event that the rest of us don't really see that way. I just don't buy your conviction. So what effectively are you doing with your conviction? What is behind that? And then there's this sense of tremendous being out of control, of not knowing. How do we proceed when we don't know? When we really don't know, and that's part of what this trickier work of sense making is to become more sensible about how we proceed when we really can't know about a lot of things, or when we know that we're being liminally hit or manipulated or drawn into things. So how do we move through there? How do we keep talking? How do we keep building coherent models of the world? And there's a lot, it's not easy work. And I think there's a lot of easier ways to handle it. And so you get around people's affect, and it's so it's sort of tough. So I try to, I do not close the door on conspiracy stuff. I stay up on it. I have particular opinions about QAnon, and could, talk more about that. But I also try to limit I don't want to become like the conspiracy guy, because it's just too unhealthy for me after a while. Like I can feel that this isn't good for you,
Right. Yeah. I'll pivot to the questions. There was a lot of good questions in the chat box. I think we were talking when I came on your podcast last about like method acting different reality tunnels in order to achieve that. And maybe this is something we can talk about offline at a later date, but we have a wisdom gym here, as I mentioned, with the Stoa. And the whole idea here is develop like a good relationship with unknowingness. And then how to do that. What kind of life practices can we do that in ecology that would help with that? And so we can have that communicative prowess when we can method act someone with reality tunnel, but with ourselves too, that we can like stay in this state of unknowingness without getting seduced or gaslighted or whatever. So I think this is a good question to start off with from Joshua. Joshua, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question to Erik?
Sure. So my question is, how would you say that COVID is weird? I'm asking because this is called the high weirdness of COVID. So what about COVID right now would you say embodies this weirdness from the 70s?
That's really great, and I didn't really define how I use the term weird, so this lets me do it. I really appreciate that question. In high weirdness, I use the category of the weird to talk about a couple of things. One is the sense of liminality that happens when your consensus reality, or ordinary reality, begins to melt down. But particularly, I was interested in those experiences and feelings and relationships that happen when you're not invoking some kind of otherworldly, mystical, or religious power. So I like take an example, and then I'll bring it into the COVID. Like let's say you have what it feels like a prophetic dream. You had the dream, you wrote it down. 2 days later, the thing you wrote down exactly happened. The yellow Chevrolet pulled up and almost hit the baby, or whatever the thing is. It's in my book. So if you are someone who accepts multiple dimensions, fate, it's all written beforehand, your abstractions about the true metaphysical reality of the world, you might say that, oh my God, this proves that there's that your mind can see into the future. This proves that the future is already written, or some large abstraction that you're using this to confirm. But then there's another approach, which is the kind of approach that I'm trying to talk about and to really actually celebrate in some ways, which is you just go, yeah, it was weird. And you're like, well, what do you mean by that? We use the term all the time. Something's weird. Oh, it was weird. It was a weird dream, weird person, weird. What are we actually saying? We don't really pay attention to the word. We don't think of it as an actual category, the way that real is a category, or illusory is a category, or uncanny even is a category. It's kind of like the uncanny, but it's a little bit darker, a little bit more materialistic in a material way, not a grabby way. And so I'm really just interested in tracing this among people who are having these experiences that have so many religious and mystical and cosmological elements in them, that their ability some of the time, not all the time, but their ability some of the time to stay grounded in that leads to what I call weird naturalism. And what I mean by that, and that's will get us to COVID, is that just this world, without invoking any metaphysical principles, mystical things, gods, other dimensions, just this world with, some physics thrown in, is or can be weird. And whether that's because anomalies keep happening no matter however we try to solve them. Maybe this one thing looked like an anomaly, and then later on we learned it actually wasn't. It can totally be explained. Oh, look, there's another anomaly on the horizon. Oh, we never transcend this character. And then you get involved into actual anomalies that, depending on where you sit and what you look at, things that are characterized by the paranormal, or things that are characterized by high dose psychedelic experience, where just weird shit happens, hard to say what's going on here. And rather than say, oh, that means there's another world, or that means there's a truth behind this one, I just want to say, no. Where we are, this place where we already are, is weird. And if you go looking for it, you're really going to find it. And sometimes it comes looking for you. And that sense of breaking down, or that sense of reality shifting that can be produced through all sorts of things, including conspiracy theory, including, learning and reading, including having these experiences, are all ways of encountering the weird. So today, I think COVID is weird in a lot of ways because it was unexpected. It is invisible, but not. The physiological effects of it are very peculiar. As far as I can tell, you know, I don't spend all my time trying to keep up on the science, but I actually know some people who do, and I talk to them about what they're doing. It's extraordinary what we don't really know. Does it affect the nervous system? Maybe it's affecting the nervous system principally, and actually the lung stuff is only a second, you know, and then the rates of reactions and how varied they are, and the quality of the turnover and whatever. So it's just created this. I mean, it's really pulled the rug out from under us. And then you get into all the social things, the fact that we have to then navigate a social reality where various authorities are both, demanding specific situations about, masks and closing stores and all this like actual shift in our social reality. But beyond that is the sense that we're almost inevitably in a conspiratorial situation. We're like, we have no choice but to wrestle with the distinct possibility that some of this stuff has multiple purposes. And I'm not that interested in that the whole thing is engineered or this and that and blah, blah, blah. I find it more likely that maybe something slipped out of a lab in China and they don't want to really tell you about it. But in a way, that doesn't matter, you know, because the conspiracy link to the origins is usually less important to what people are, how people are actually weaponizing and exploiting the situation as it evolves. And of course we can see that. So in order to really try to understand where we are, we have no choice but to kind of go into a realm of the unknown where inevitably certain kinds of patterns that are more archetypal or mythical take the stage, where you start wondering about, well, maybe this is a kind of, who would be behind it? Oh, it's the, you know, the dark room with all the people in their hands on the levers manipulating things. You're like, no, it can't be that far. It can't be that far. But yet there's something kind of curious about X and Y, or the, look how quickly we're thinking about, oh, I can't wait for contract tracing so I can go out and enjoy my life. And you're like, wait. A year ago, I was already horrified with the loss of privacy that we had then. And now I'm like looking for, wait, what happened to me? So if you're paying attention, you enter into what Wilson called a kind of chapel perilous, where you no longer have a really concrete way of organizing the totality of your experience, and this sort of strongly supported sense that there are multiple ways of looking at the thing, that nobody really knows what's going on, that no one's really driving the bus, and that the bus is kind of careening down the hill. And so the weirdness is to not deny the peculiarity of the situation by holding on to some, oh, it's going to go back to the way it was, or, oh, I can just trust all these agencies, or what I get from these news feeds is what's really going on, and so I can feel okay and, you know, stay calm. Sorry, I don't think you can do that. But what do you do then? Then you kind of accept that you're in this situation of the weird, and then use practical tools and your own self-work as a way of staying awake and sane and grounded in relationship to it. But I think the weirdness is, it's almost like a perfect example of it, because it's not metaphysical, but yet people think about it that way. You know, whether they are think like, oh, it's a message from the earth. You know, this is the virus is the vaccine. It's the thing that's waking us up. Or no, it's this instrument of malfeasant, you know, New World Order, transhumanist Illuminati. Well, okay, so now then we're in another myth. But even if you try to stay really close to the facts on the ground in a really secular and grounded way, and whatever, you're also just seeing the instability of scientific knowledge, the incapacity of all of these authorities to really handle things in the way that you would imagine that their authority and their training and their public role would illuminate. So the sense of being unmoored, of being at sea, of scrambling, like all of those are actual experiences, but they're not just you, like, oh, it's my emotions, I can't handle it, or I'm scared, or whatever. No, the thing itself is going wiggy. Like the actual historical moment is getting weirder. And that shifts, to my mind, shifts the way you experience it, because it's not like your fault. You're not expected to know the answer, and that's where we get into this not knowing thing. And that one of the problems right now is that everybody's so used to knowing that even people who have no business coming to some kind of unusual conviction about what's going on based on the information they're taking in, or their quality of critical thought, or anything like that. They're so convinced because that's what everybody does. That's what they do on the TV. These get a point counterpoint. They each yell at each other, each trying to get each other on their own terms, into their own axioms. So being able to move through the fog of war, or through the fog of information war, without pretending it's not going on, but also not being overwhelmed by that, is a very particular art that I think resonates very much with the sense-making practices, this not knowing practices. And it's where, in a way, people who are drawn to this kind of thinking, it's like, this is the metal meets the road kind of thing. I mean, this is where we're actually having to do it and stumble through it. But to my mind, it's like, it's ever more clear that it's, that there's another way through this kind of stuff that's really important for at least some of us to keep alive, because if only because the way that conviction, poisons our vision of the capacity of being able to steer through this, either individually or collectively, because it's so concretized that it doesn't allow any shift. So you get all these polarizations, and then a restaging of the fight. And so now there's a fight about masks, and you have it on, you're this and da da da, and you're like, wow. I'd rather say this is weird in a way. It's almost comforting. I hope that makes sense.
We have a question that kind of can take onto that nicely. Travis Mann, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter. Erik, so what is your assessment of Robert Anton Wilson's legacy in terms of kind of espousing this generalized agnosticism? You spoke about some of the failed collective sense-making experiences from the 70s. Do you have any examples of like successes in Robert Anton Wilson's legacy, not just on an individual level of coming into terms with the weirdness that we face on a daily basis, but also like societally, this generalized agnosticism being applied to forming groups and things of that nature?
Those are great questions. I'll do my best. I wish I could have more on the last one than I think I do. I think that, the legacy of Wilson is a very interesting one, because again, as I was writing this, I was like going more and more like, whoa, this is so similar to what's happening. At the time I was writing in particular was I was finishing around the lead up to 2016, to the Trump election. And there was all the, Pepe the Frog stuff, and all the sense that a certain kind of internet savvy prankster nihilist humor mode was being had been weaponized and was being used very forcibly in order to, do information warfare, at least online. How influential that was in the end, it's very, very hard to say, but it clearly got a lot of press and got people aware of it. And I think it was influential in some ways, and continues to be in different ways. I think it never stays put. It kind of changes, and then it breaks down, and other things can absorb it, and but it was very pointed. And without going into specifics, there's things about Wilson in the late 60s and early 70s where they were doing exactly that. They were doing pranks that took advantage of other people's conspiracy paranoias in order to just fuck with them, and to do it in a way, not in a mean way, in sort of a spirit of anarchic, yippie sort of like countercultural politics, to make fun of them and to also create room. And I think that's in a way, that's the example of what you're talking about, but it's also is an example of something that I won't say failed, but maybe by its very nature is difficult to organize. So if you look at both the yippies and at the more small scale Discordians who were more anarchic in the 60s and the 70s, you know, they were using a kind of Zen prankster playfulness in order to reflect back the unacknowledged contradictions or investments of the mainstream society. You know, like going to levitate the Pentagon in 1967. Like, that's absurd. Pentagon is not going to go up into the space, nor is it going to turn orange. And yet, by celebrating the idea that we were all going to come together, all these different tribes and, you know, weirdos from the Lower East Side and, you know, civil rights people and communists and whatever, we're going to come together and live, you know, levitate the Pentagon. It created a kind of social myth that actually said something about the movement and its capacity to reimagine the future, not just to respond and react to the concrete power dynamics of the present, but to imagine something greater than that, and to do so with humor and with a kind of not taking yourself seriously that was also very serious. So that's a subtle set of feelings and expressions that in the late 60s definitely had a role. I mean, part of political protest in this late 60s had this like prankster, open-ended kind of quality to it. But it doesn't really lend itself very well to, let's say, conventional party politics. And that's part of the point. And so one of the ways you can demonstrate that with particularly Robert Anton Wilson stuff and the kind of pranks they did is you don't really have a good example of that kind of pranking attitude. You have some with the Church of the Subgenius. They kind of carried it forward. It was a little bit less political in some ways, or the targets were easier, making fun of Christianity, you know, making fun, you know, but it still had that anarchic, open-ended, humorous, but you know, politically informed quality to it. But it's not really till you get to the flip side of, you know, the meme magic alt-right guys in 2015, 2016, that you actually see something that's that political, except now it's from the other side. You know, they were anarchists, so there was always some libertarian, you know, anti-state attitudes inside Robert Anton Wilson stuff. So they're not just figures of the left, but still they would have nothing to do with this kind of monster, or in a way, sorry, I'm falling into a myth, but that kind of activity. And yet there you are looking at its logic. So as somebody who's like a Robert Anton Wilson fan and thinks he's important, thinks he's even politically important, I got to deal with that. And it's not easy, because you know, again, it's that I mean, I hate to say this because it's not a conclusion that I want to either believe or even have to reckon with. But I do think that some of this stuff we're talking about, it just doesn't work on a large scale. And so you get back into that thing of there's sort of not secret schools, but just sort of under the radar nodes of ways of looking at reality that have a certain kind of tentativeness and an acceptance of ambiguity, an acceptance of multiplicity that isn't like powerlessness. It's not like postmodern relativism where like, oh, everybody's story is equal, nobody knows. That's not what I'm talking about at all. But it does acknowledge a kind of a power of those multiple viewpoints that most political parties, most people shrink away from. They don't want to deal with that. And so when you ask about what are these forms that it could take that aren't just individual, that are beyond what like this is, which is a kind of tentative node off to the side where the individuals involved are plugged into some pretty interesting things, but they tend to also be further networks of this kind of interstice place, rather than something that coalesces and coheres in a very obvious way such that it could become another obvious memetic tribe. And that's both its strength and its weakness. It's like you can wake up in the midst of any historical situation, but the terms that you're waking up in may not be translatable to the majority of people who are going on in that situation. So if you're interested in how waking up applies and is lived through a moment of historical transition or transformation or breakdown or whatever, it's tough. You know, I want to say that in a way it's like a, you know, what was that phrase? Let me just look over here. Oh yeah, the whole idea of the invisible college. So the idea of the invisible college, which is sort of a motif in some, you know, conspiracy theories too, was a way that the Royal Society first started to refer to itself in the 17th century, the early 17th century, when the Rosicrucians were happening and like science hadn't quite crystallized as like an alternate form of belief, and it was still embedded in kind of esoteric ideas, but people were sensing that we were moving out of the Middle Ages, that there were new forms of government that were coming, something about reason was letting things happen. It was a transition point, a liminal point. And the idea of an invisible college is that you're sort of like, you have colleagues everywhere. It's not very visible. You are engaged in active political life, but it's not, doesn't massify, it's not as obvious in a way. And it sets the stage for something else. And, you know, I think that's also a really good thing to remember when you're feeling lost, or when you're feeling like, how does this actually help? You know, is that you can't know how these very tentative relationships or practices that you have now are seeding or setting the stage for something else that's going to happen, which might be very different. You know, we might be changing the way we think in some fundamental ways 50 years down the line or whatever. I mean, I don't want to get into all of the different things that could be happening in the future, but because it's so oppressive and overwhelming. But I think it's very good to honor the tiny little bit that you're doing. It's like, you know, in a way, it's almost like being in a, you know, if there's like a wisdom teacher around you, and it's someone who's like, they are on it. They got the goods. Like they're, you know, whatever, where you think about it religiously or philosophically, but someone who's really like a wise person. And he or she is creating a scene where people go. But, you know, if you go to these things, you look around, like a lot of these people there for kind of weird reasons, and some of them aren't so smart, and some of them are kind of gossipy, and some you don't agree with, and then you're not even sure why you're there, and like, why am I really being here? And you can say, oh, this is all just kind of pointless, but that's like the way, like wisdom, you know, wisdom doesn't manifest on the front page. So it has a quality of kind of through the cracks, and it may not help, but it kind of also has to be what it is. And so I feel like this kind of thing that we're pointing to, it almost inevitably has that quality to it. And that the best thing we can do is to keep being as robustly collective and connected as we can be, to not sort of just give up and become a monad, to stay embodied, but also stay embodied together, even if it's just 30 people on a Zoom call or whatever, that this is it in a way for this right now. And to be okay with that degree of decenteredness, even though it's so obviously not sufficient to, you know, fight back systematic racism or narratives being crammed down our throat from the CDC or from Bill Gates or from the kooks on QAnon or whatever it is. It's like, this is a drop in the bucket, but it's also where we are. And so I hope that's provides something.
Yeah, thank you.
So we have about 10 minutes or 8 minutes. I think we can sneak in another question, Erik.
Yeah,
is it,
sure.
is it okay if we go over a little bit, or do we have to?
Yeah, let's just answer this question and then wrap it up.
Great. Okay. You know, Lisa Norton, you had a question about Mark Fisher, which I was kind of interested in. Could you unmute yourself and ask it?
Yeah, Erik, thank you. Apologies, I haven't read your new book, but I was wondering if you connected how you square or orient your notion of weirdness to people like Mark Fisher's The Weird and the Eerie, or some of the OOO people like Levi Bryant or Timothy Morton.
Great, thanks for that question. That's a nice, it's a good one, because I got Fisher stuff relatively late into the writing, but I did manage to find some very wonderful overlaps that were really, really, really important to me. The main one that really helped me is the difference, which I talk about in the introduction, between the uncanny and the weird. And the uncanny is sort of it's a more like acceptable notion. Certainly in academia, it's kind of like already has its sort of zone in a way that the weird doesn't. I think there's actually some really concrete issues of demographics and cultural class behind that. The weird is a lowbrow form. The uncanny is a higher brow form. But more importantly is that the uncanny is essentially psychological. So the way that Fisher talks about it is he says, the uncanny all ultimately refers in. It's the internal family drama that's left its trace that then is discovered again in exteriority. Whereas the weird is the relationship to the outside. And that difference for me is totally key. I mean, it's really important, is that the weird is not just my feeling. The weird is of a tenor, an ambiance of a relation to an outside or an other that is ultimately unassimilable. And that's where it gets into the triple O stuff, which is also very much a part of it. I got to hang out with Morton a bunch at Rice, and I read a lot of those guys, and I love it. It was like the biggest kind of philosophical discovery that I had had in many, many years, where I felt, yeah, this stuff is really, really good for what I'm doing, even if I'm doing it, directing it in somewhat different directions. And there again, what I really appreciate when they talk, my whole idea about weird naturalism is not that different than weird essentialism that Morton talks about, and now I'm spacing his name. The guy who teaches in North Africa. Why am I forgetting his name? Anyway, and the idea there is just that we are really in a world of objects. There are real things everywhere. It's not just an illusion in your mind. It's not just some expression of Maya and those kind of old mystical psychedelic ideas, which I don't think are very helpful anymore. We're actually embedded in all sorts of, real networks with relationality with all of these objects on many, many different levels of scale, but that there's an essential opacity to those objects. So we're in this weird situation where we're in relationship with something we can never capture with our representations, that can never be perfectly translated. But it's not just an isolated reflectivity where all I have is my own projections. That's what the difference is that there is something like an encounter. It's just that the encounter can't be adequately represented, and it can't be captured, and it can't be entirely directed. And in a way, that's part of its strength. That's certainly part of its political strength. It's ecological strength, is we have to really open up to the fact that we are embedded in objects and hyper objects that are so far beyond our capacity, even collectively, to understand. And yet we have to act from that responsibility and that awareness. And the way that I take that in my kind of more visionary and psychedelic way in the book is to talk about what's happening in extraordinary experience is something like this encounter where even the projections aren't really adequate anymore, and yet it remains unassimilable. So it doesn't give you a revelation. So the minute you go and, I talked to the mind, like psychedelic people, I hit the mind of the planet, and it told me that the COVID is part of a healing process. It's like, no, you've already lost it. And I'm not saying you didn't encounter the mind of Gaia. It's just that encounter scrambles as much as it initiates, and that's our weird situation. And we have to move within that, both the limitations and I think the openness of that situation. So again and again, it's like relationships to exteriority, to material conditions, to historical material conditions, but also to recognizing the fundamental weirdness in that relation that also offers room to maneuver that a strict determinism or a strict physicalism doesn't at all. And we could talk more about triple O and how different flavors go in different directions around science, around determinism, around human psychic activity, and does it have any purpose, and things like that. But yeah, I really appreciate you pointing that stuff out, because it was really important to me in developing the kind of argumentation and armature of the book.
Great, thank you. So we have a lot of awesome questions. Unfortunately, we can't get to them all today. So Erik, we would love to have you come back another time. Any closing thoughts you have for us at the Stoa?
No, this is great. I mean, I really, I really admire your work in particular, and I thought, I mean, I'm still kind of, wrestling with some of the issues that you brought up that we were talking about on expanding mind, and I think we have I mean, it's funny. It's like, I guess this is the thing I'll leave you with, is that as someone who's been very interested in spiritual practices and psychedelics, in these sort of internal seeking narratives, even as I'm also interested in politics and history and science and physical, natural history, and the real place we are, real, that, there's always this sense that there's something indulgent or narcissistic or deluded about spiritual work or philosophical spiritual
Right.
work, whatever you want to call it. That it's it's only because of your privilege, and you're doing it to, like, just deal with your neuroses and get over with it and get out there and start doing stuff. And I, in sort of a not necessarily a happy news way, but that the value of that work in my life and in the people around me who seem awake now, that I can have a conversation with, that's a real conversation, almost invariably means there's something like that going on in their life too. So to me, it's very clear the concrete payoff value of this kind of work at a time like this. And not saying that it can't, it can lead you foul too. One little side note, just because we talked about QAnon, is one of the reasons that I had been I've been paying a lot of attention to it recently, was that there was a noticeable uptick, noticed by me and many other people who I know personally, and observers and other people who I didn't know who reflected on it, a noticeable uptick in the last couple of months among alternative medicine, yoga, psychedelic, Burning Man, those kind of zones of straight up QAnon myth. Oftentimes they didn't even know what it was.
Right.
And I was like, whoa, something has happened. So obviously a lot of this kind of spiritual stuff can go awry in a variety of ways. And in a way, the history of the 70s is all you need to know to show that. But that this particular quality of adding a philosophical self-reflection and a certain kind of logic of sort of self work, I don't want to say self-control, but some of that kind of willingness to limit and constrain certain aspects of the self in light of other demands, and playing with that, some of that discipline, as part of a way of going deeper into the mystery, rather than it just erecting an individual self. That these practices are really helpful right now. They're really good, and that we need them, and that through them we can also form kinds of collectivities and relationships and conversations that just have a coherence and an honesty and a kind of what is it? A sort of, like, in a way, the quality of the warrior quality of being, awake and staring your fear in its face. It's like we have like fear confusion, but there's that same, like, just stand up again. Okay, there. Oh, you fell. Get up again. That kind of practice or that kind of discipline seems really key right now. And so, I really appreciate the way that you and your communities are weaving these things together as well.
Yeah. And my sense is that Stoicism could have a role in helping with this. So in a moment, if you can stay around for just one more minute, you can listen to some of the upcoming things in our Wisdom Gym. But thanks so much for coming on, my friend. It was greatly appreciated. And we would love to have you back to tease out all these different threads.
Oh, yeah. It's fun.
So let's talk about a couple of events in the Wisdom Gym. We have a few of our facilitators here. Travis, man, you have something called Breaking the Frame. If you can go off mute and tell us what that is.
Yeah, certainly. So breaking the frame is actually directly related to a lot of the stuff that we talked about here. So it's some relational exercises through which we try to cultivate intellectual humility and cognitive flexibility by examining our own relationship with our worldviews. So you can sign up. I'm posting a link in the chat right now for the registration there. Hope to see you there.
Thank you. And I really like that. It's like kind of adopting a narrative and then breaking it and finding the alternative one and then jumping from narrative to narrative. Tyson, you have a flowing through unknowingness.
Yeah, flowing with unknowingness. That is, for me, a session that has come out of me wanting to deepen my relationship with weirdness and unknowingness. And so we practice freestyle rap and spoken word as a group to really come into a deeper relationship with like the unknowingness of creativity and seeing how well we can trust ourselves to open up and say that first word, and then to see if we can enter that space of flow together. And it's a really wonderful way to get to know people in a session that just really embraces the weirdness. And yeah, I look forward to seeing some of you there.
Yeah, that session particularly puts me at the edge of my comfort zone. So I hope to see Erik there that next Saturday. And then Steve Beatty, you have the Stoic Breath on Sundays.
Yes, that's right. Sunday at 10, the Stoic Breath, and it's a practice of Stoicism through breath work, and it's a great way to. It actually ties into a lot of what we were just talking about now about departing from the real world, which is all the big distraction, and going into the weird a little bit for some self-reflection in that breath practice. So it's just a breath practice to get you into a very, very deep state of meditation, but being aware of yourself enough while you're in there to find out what's going on the inside and really observe yourself outside of the distractions of the real world. So yeah, that's every Saturday at 10.
And it's a beautiful way to start your Saturday. And then just an event that got posted. James Karst from Finite Infinite Games is coming to the Stoa next week. Oh my God. I'm just so like stoked about this one. That's playing the Infinite game during the Meta Crisis. That's June 17th at 3 p.m. Eastern time. You can go on the Stoa website and RSVP there. And the Stoa is based off a gift economy. I'm viewing it as a gift for all of us to freely use in this time of need. If you're inspired to give a gift to the Stoa, you can go to the website. Actually, you can go to, we have a gift economy website. You can give a gift directly to the Stoa or to any of the facilitators that just talked or at the Stoa. So that being said, thank you so much, everyone, for coming out today.
Thanks.
Cool.